of ancient copper sheets covered in Hebrew of ancient copper sheets covered in Hebrew lettering, transcripts of scroll fragments, and one page, handwritten, with 3 words underlined so hard the pen had torn through the paper. They always knew. The man who wrote that was named John Marco Allegro. He was born on February 17, 1923. He died on February 17, 1988. His 65th birthday, the same date as if the calendar itself had decided to make a point. His colleagues at universities across Europe and America said nothing publicly when he died. After 30 years of trying to silence him, they had finally gotten what they wanted. But here's where it gets strange. As everything Allegro spent his life trying to warn the world about, everything they buried him for, professionally, systematically, completely, was proven right just 3 years after he died. And what it revealed about the Dead Sea Scrolls, about the people who hid them, about the people who found them, and then hid them again, is the story you were never supposed to hear. You have to understand what was found first. Because until you feel the weight of it, the suppression doesn't make sense. The Judean desert in winter sits at the edge of something that doesn't feel quite alive. The Dead Sea stretches south and east, flat, mineral, wrong-colored, the lowest point on the surface of the earth. The cliffs above it are pale limestone, cracked by centuries of dry heat and cold nights, riddled with caves that catch the early morning mist and hold it until the sun climbs high enough to burn it off. Stand there at dawn, and the ruins of Qumran emerge from that mist like broken teeth. Old walls, old cisterns, old silence. It was into those cliffs, in the winter of 1946, that a teenage Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed Dib threw a rock. He wasn't looking for anything. He was tending his flock above the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, roughly 24 kilometers east of Jerusalem, and he threw a stone into a dark opening the way teenagers throw things into dark openings. Because it was there. And instead of the flat thud of rock hitting rock, he heard something that stopped him cold. A crack, then a shatter. The sound of a clay jar, sealed tight, untouched, sitting in bone-dry darkness since before the Roman Empire, breaking open after 2,000 years. He climbed in, found more jars, found leather scrolls inside, wrapped in linen, the ancient fibers holding together in air so dry it had preserved them better than any museum could. He pulled one out. The leather was dark and stiff. The ink was faded, but readable. Old Hebrew script, dense, careful. The work of someone who had been writing seriously. He didn't know what it said. He didn't know what he had. He sold them to a cobbler. The cobbler sold 4 to a Syrian Orthodox archbishop named Athanasius Yeshui Samuel for under $100. The archbishop tried to sell them on, offered them to Yale, to other institutions, to anyone with the right credentials. Nobody bit, nobody cared. So in June 1954, 7 years after that jar shattered, 7 years after the most important manuscripts in recorded history passed through the hands of a Bethlehem cobbler, Archbishop Samuel placed an ad in the Wall Street Journal. Under miscellaneous items for sale, he wrote, "Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution." Stop. Read that again. The most consequential archaeological discovery in human history, advertised in a newspaper classifieds column. An Israeli archaeologist and former general named Yigael Yadin purchased all 4 scrolls through an American intermediary for $250,000. The state of Israel now had them. They went into the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, under a white dome shaped like the lid of the very jars that held them. But between that shepherd and that white dome, a decision was made. A quiet one, a 40-year one. And it changed everything. In 1953, a small team of 9 international scholars was assembled in East Jerusalem, then under Jordanian control, and given exclusive access to study, translate, and publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of them. The unpublished fragments, the controversial ones, the ones still being pulled from caves. The man chosen to lead that team, to stand at the gate and decide what the world was allowed to know, was Father Roland Deveau, a French Dominican priest based at the École Biblique, a Catholic institute of biblical research in Jerusalem, operating under the direct authority of the Vatican. See the problem? A Catholic priest, running the only team on earth with access to documents that could rewrite the story Christianity was built on. Documents that predated Jesus. Documents written by people who had a completely different understanding of who God was, who the Messiah was, and what the temple was supposed to be. And for 40 years, not 4, not 1440, that team decided who could see the scrolls and who couldn't. 2 generations of scholars worldwide wrote letters, filed requests, made appeals, showed up in person, demanded access under the principles of academic transparency. Father Devoe's team said no. Herschel Shanks, the publisher of the Biblical Archaeology Review, fought this for years. His words: "For almost 40 years, a small group of international researchers held a tight monopoly on access to the scrolls, an infuriating 2 generations of scholars. Why would they hide it? What were they protecting? And more importantly, what happens when the world finally gets to see?" John Marco Allegro knew the answer to those questions, or he thought he did, and that thought destroyed him. He was the only non-cleric on Devoe's team of 9, a British archaeologist and linguist, born February 17, 1923. Brought in because he could read ancient Semitic languages the others struggled with. Younger, sharper, no church standing in the way of what the texts actually said. He read them, all of them. And in 1956, before the monopoly had fully locked shut, he went on BBC radio and said something the team had explicitly not authorized. He said the scrolls described a messianic leader who had been crucified before Jesus, a suffering, a dying figure already worshipped at Qumran, already in the culture, already there. Listen to what happened next. Father Deveau drafted a letter, signed by the other 8 team members, and sent it to the BBC, a formal, coordinated public denunciation of their own colleague. Not a private correction, a public one, dispatched to a broadcaster to be placed on record. That's not scholarly disagreement. That's a silencing operation. Allegro was marginalized within the team, but he didn't stop. He pushed for the copper scroll, a bizarre metallic object found in Cave 3 in March 1952, to be sent to Manchester University's College of Technology. In 1955 and 1956, Professor H. Wright Baker sawed it into 23 strips to read the text locked inside. Allegro supervised the entire process. No, he stood in that lab and listened to the sound of a metal saw cutting through corroded copper, through 2,000 years of silence, a sound like nothing else in the world. And he read what was inside before anyone or anyone else on Earth. One researcher who was present that day reported something afterward. They said Allegro stood at the table for a long time without speaking, just reading, rereading. Then he looked up. "This isn't what they think it is," he said. By 1970, Allegro had gone further than anyone on the team was willing to follow. He argued that the words themselves, in the scrolls, in the texts he'd spent 20 years reading, pointed to religious traditions running deeper and older than anything the church's official story acknowledged. His colleagues didn't just disagree, they coordinated his destruction, public dismissals, institutional blacklisting. His name quietly removed from the narrative of who had worked on the scrolls. He died on his birthday, February 17, 1988. His position gone, his credibility gone, his desk covered in notes nobody would read. Careers destroyed, one man's life erased. But that's not even the strangest part. 3 years after Allegro died, a library in California blew the whole thing open. September 22, 1991. The Huntington Library in San Marino opened its complete photographic collection of Dead Sea Scroll images to any scholar who requested access. No restrictions, no conditions, no gatekeepers. The New York Times ran it as news. Monopoly over Dead Sea Scrolls is ended. The reaction from DeVoe's old team, some of its members aging, some already dead, was volcanic. Legal threats, i.e. formal complaints, accusations of intellectual property theft over documents they hadn't written, didn't own, and had been funded by public and academic institutions to study for 4 decades. The library director's response was 7 words. We are not bound to suppress these. That word, suppress, landed in newspapers around the world. Within weeks, scholars who had waited their entire careers broke into the archive. And within weeks, the bombshells started hitting. Another layer peeled back. November 8, 1991, New York Times. Messianic link to Christianity is found in scrolls. Dr. Robert Eisenman of California State University at Long Beach had found something. Fragment 4, Q285, 1.5 inches wide, 1 inch tall, 6 lines of ancient text, unstudied, unpublished, as sitting in a drawer for decades after the monopoly locked the archive down. The pierced Messiah text. Look at what the Hebrew says. Eisenman's translation describes a messianic figure who is either killing an enemy or being killed. The ambiguity is real. But Eisenman read it as the latter, a dying, suffering Messiah figure. Already expected, already written down, already believed in Jewish communities at Qumran before the birth of Jesus. Do the math on what that means. If a dying Messiah was already a Jewish concept, already present in the scrolls, already circulating in the culture, then the story of Christianity as the origination of that idea looks completely different, not a divine revelation, an inheritance. The inheritance of something that was already there. Doesn't add up, does it? Chen had limited access before 1991, stated that 4Q285 had been internally flagged as sensitive during the monopoly years and deliberately deprioritized. Not because the parchment was damaged, because of what it said. The Vatican never commented. The remaining members of DeVoe's old team issued no statement. To this day, no formal explanation exists for why that specific fragment never made the priority publication list now. The Copper Scroll. And this is where the story becomes something else entirely. You can go see it yourself. The Jordan Museum in Amman, Jordan. Permanent display since 2013. Labeled 3Q15. Walk in, buy a ticket, stand in front of it. It's there. Well, what it is, and I need you to actually sit with this, is a document made of metal. 2 copper sheets, alloyed with 1% tin. Originally a single scroll, 7.9 feet long. Found on March 14, 1952. Pushed to the very back of Cave 3 at Qumran. Separated from every other scroll. Not mixed in with the others. Set apart. hidden within the hiding place, as if whoever left it there wanted even the people who found the other scrolls to miss this one. The other manuscripts were religious. Scripture, community regulations, songs, battle hymns. The Copper Scroll is a list, 64 locations across the ancient Judean landscape, from the Valley of Achor, north of Jericho, to cisterns beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, to unnamed caves in the hills. At each location, something specific. Gold ingots, silver chests, sacred temple vessels. Now read column 3 of the scroll. It says, "In the great cistern within the courtyard of the peristyle, 900 talents. 900 talents of silver. 30 metric tons at one location. The total value of everything across all 64 sites, estimated conservatively in 1960, exceeded $1 million. At today's metals prices, you're talking billions. Let that sink in. Now ask the question, why has none of it ever been found? Not 1 gram, not one vessel, not a single gold ingot from any of those 64 locations in 70 years of intensive archaeology in one of the most thoroughly excavated landscapes on the surface of the planet. Archaeologists in the Judean desert have found Roman coins, ancient seeds, human bones, pottery shards from the 1st century. They find things constantly. They find everything. Not one item from the Copper Scroll's list. Then it got worse. The final entry on the Copper Scroll, column 12, mentions a duplicate document. A second copy of the map, with additional details even more precise than what the copper itself contains. A backup. A second key. Never found. Never referenced in any other discovered text. Gone. Check for yourself. Column 12 is translated and publicly available through the Israel Antiquities Authority database. The reference to the second document is there. The second document is not. And no one has ever offered a credible explanation for where it went. Why would you engrave fiction on copper? On the one material specifically chosen because it wouldn't rot, wouldn't burn, wouldn't fade? You don't immortalize a shopping list on metal. You immortalize something that matters. Us, in some ways, is the darkest thing in all. In some ways, is the darkest thing in all 11 caves. The Temple Scroll, catalog number 11Q19, the longest Dead Sea Scroll ever recovered, nearly 28 feet of text, perfectly preserved. It emerged publicly in the 1970s, and the circumstances of how it surfaced, who held it before formal acquisition, where it had been in the intervening decades. Murky. Genuinely, officially murky. What it contains is the part that should stop you cold. It rewrites the book of Deuteronomy, word by word, beginning to end. But not in Moses' voice, not as a prophet recording divine speech, in God's voice, first person, active. I command you, I instruct you. I'll build the temple exactly as I now say, not as it is described elsewhere. I'm not making this up. A scroll found in the same limestone caves as the Hebrew Bible, written in the same ancient script, preserved in the same clay jars, claiming to supersede the Bible, to replace it, to override Moses with a direct divine transmission that the official scripture got wrong. Think about what that means. The community at Qumran didn't just study the Torah. They believed they had a newer, corrected version of it, one that nobody else knew existed. And that was just the scripture. They also ran an entirely parallel calendar system. Scholars decoded Scroll 4Q324D, a liturgical calendar document, and confirmed the Qumran community lived by a 364-day solar calendar, as completely incompatible with the standard lunar Jewish calendar used by the temple in Jerusalem. Different days of rest, different festival dates, different laws about when to pray and when not to. These people weren't copying scripture. They were building an alternative civilization. A shadow Israel, hidden in the limestone above a Dead Sea, following laws the rest of the world didn't have access to, waiting for a war that would settle the question of which Israel was the real one. The War Scroll, Document 1QM, is their operational plan for that war. The war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. Not a metaphor. A literal military document. Formations, weapons, trumpet call patterns, a 7-phase campaign against the Roman legions. Detailed, specific, operational. Why would anyone be afraid of this? What happens if the truth about these people gets out? Now, June 2025. And this is where it stops being a history lesson. An international research team published a study combining radiocarbon dating with artificial intelligence. They trained machine learning models on the micro-level handwriting of individual scribes. Pen angle, stroke pressure, letter spacing, and matched those patterns across fragments to establish age ranges more precise than carbon dating alone could achieve. The result shook the field. Several Dead Sea Scrolls are up to 100 years older than previously believed. Some fragments date to approximately 300 BCE, pushing their origins back to around 2,300 years ago. The Great Isaiah Scroll, the most complete and significant biblical manuscript that has ever existed, may be a full century older than its accepted dating. Listen to what that number actually means. 100 years. That's not a rounding error. That's a generation. If these texts are a century older than the agreed timeline, then the ideas inside them, the dying Messiah, the corrected Torah, the shadow Israel in the desert, the apocalyptic war, were circulating in Jewish culture before the political machinery that supposedly created those ideas was even running. Before the Roman occupation of Judea, before Herod built his temple, before the cultural conditions that supposedly gave birth to early Christianity. The origin story doesn't hold if the scrolls came first. The AI team noted, almost casually, near the end of their published study, that rescanning of certain fragments in 2025 had revealed hidden diagram structures embedded in the parchment, invisible to the naked eye for 2,000 years. Geometric patterns that don't correspond to any known text. What they represent is still being studied. Still think it's coincidence? Here's where we are. Not where the official account wants to place us. Where the documented record actually leaves us. A teenage shepherd cracks a jar in 1946. A Dominican priest locks the contents away for 40 years. The one team member who screams about suppression gets destroyed professionally and dies on his birthday. His desk covered in notes no one published. A copper treasure map describes billions in hidden temple gold and produces 0 recoveries in 7 decades. A fragment describing a pre-Christian dying Messiah spends 40 years in a drawer with an internal, sensitive flag on it. The longest scroll in the collection rewrites the Torah in God's own first-person voice. And in June 2025, AI reveals the whole collection is a century older than we were told, while hidden diagrams are only now becoming visible. Look it up, all of it. The New York Times article from November 8, 1991. The Washington Post from September 22, 1991. The Copper Scroll in Amman. Go see it yourself. Fragment 4, Q285 in the Israel Antiquities Authority's online catalog. The 2025 AI study published in Science magazine. Every single thing in this video is publicly verifiable right now, today. None of this is speculation. None of this is fringe. This happened. And none of it has been adequately explained by the people responsible for explaining it. Because after 75 years, nobody has answered 3 questions. Not once. Not on record. Why did a Catholic-led team restrict access to these documents for 40 years? And what exactly was in the unpublished material that required that long to prepare the world for? Y has the most precisely described ancient treasure map in existence, engraved on copper specifically so it would survive until found, produced 0 recoveries in the most archaeologically active region on Earth. And why did a fragment that potentially rewrites the story Christianity is built on spend 4 decades in a drawer before anyone outside the Monopoly team was allowed to read it? I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm asking you to try to explain those 3 questions with the official story. Go ahead. Because here's what the evidence points to, if you follow it without flinching. The community at Qumran wasn't a footnote. They weren't gentle monks copying text in the desert. They were a breakaway civilization, running a parallel law, a parallel calendar, a parallel theology, a parallel military strategy, convinced that the temple in Jerusalem was corrupt, that the priests were illegitimate, and that the war they were preparing for would prove them right. They pressed their truth into copper and clay. They hid it in 11 caves in a limestone cliff above the lowest point on Earth. And then the Romans came, the ground vibrating with that low, bone-deep frequency that you felt before you heard. Thus the march of Legius Sixfratensis moving through the desert heat. And they ran. 1,879 years later, a teenager's thrown rock opened it back up. And 60 years after that, a library in California finally let the world in. But not all the way in. Not even close. The duplicate document from the Copper Scroll's final entry, the second map, the more precise one, has never been found. The hidden diagrams discovered in the 2025 rescanning are still being decoded. The cryptic A, B, and C scripts embedded in several fragments remain only partially translated as of today. Early morning mist still moves through the Qumran Valley. The ruins still surface from the haze at dawn, like something the desert is reluctant to give up. And somewhere in the limestone above the Dead Sea, in a crack, in a sealed cistern, on under a floor that hasn't been disturbed since 68 CE, something is still waiting. They hid everything they had. Maybe what we found is only part of it. Try explaining that with the official story.